Well, now the engine was running and I found out that the brakes were good and the steering was good and there were some lights, I was able to use the Hotchkiss and keep it going as a running restoration. But anyone who's ever bought a sort of barn find or a vehicle that's not been used for 40 or 50 years, you realise that one after another problems arise. And so this little video is about all the sort of bits and pieces that I had to do to the Hotch during the running repairs of the car. So firstly, the tyres. Now some of these were wonderfully bald with just no tread on at all, but unfortunately they couldn't stay on the car, even though I would have liked that. Now these are beaded edge tyres, which means they're really rather like a big rubber band, and they're extremely difficult to get on and off the wheel, and you have to use a technique involving hammers and levers to get them off, and you have to be pretty strong. I'm not pretty strong. It's probably the last time I'll ever do these. I managed to get a set of tyres from Vintage Tyres at Bewley. With the tubes, they worked out about £300 a wheel. This photo is taken just after I got the car on the road, and you can see the spare wheel is much fatter than the narrow 820 by 120 road wheels. This is because the spare wheels that came with the car were Michelin Bibendums, and quite wrong for this Hotchkiss AM, plus you couldn't get those tyres anymore. So I had to buy a couple of new wheels that came from Holland, the right 820 by 120 rims, and I had to remove the Hotchkiss hub from the Bibendum wheels, and then the Dutch wheels I had to cut to receive the Hotchkiss hubs and do a bit of spacing with wood and so on. But in the end they made pretty presentable wheels that are now on the car as spare wheels. I chose the best of the old tyres that had been on the car to use as spares. So now the Hotch was good enough to take out onto little trips. This was our first one, just a few miles from home. Soon after I ventured out to Somerset, about 40 miles away, to Dinnington Docks, a favourite amongst vintage car owners, but there disaster struck. It was a very hot day, 29 degrees, and when I came to drive home I discovered that the magneto had seized up because the varnish had melted, and I had to get the RAC out, the first of only 2 times. So this is a spare magneto that I bought from France to have rebuilt, and the original one on the car was rebuilt by Armoto, but I should have learned a lesson from a previous car. If you ever buy a barn find or an old vintage car that the magneto looks great on, don't think it will be. It will fail you, so you have to have them rewound because the coils usually give up on their first few journeys. The weakness on these cars is that the exhaust manifold cracks by the last bend, and you can see this one has got a lot of bulging on it where I had it specially welded by cast iron welding services, but it has since failed. It is a weakness and there's not much I can do about that. Well, after a lot more driving and general reliability, I noticed a bit of a rattle in the engine and tracked it down to this sort of Tufnol drive coupling for the dynamo. So that was a simple question of making a new Tufnol block and riveting it back together. Well, my second RAC call out was I'd driven only a short distance one day and the engine stopped, and it turned out to be stripped teeth on the fibre timing gear, as you can see in this lower part of the picture. The upper part of the picture is a new fibre timing gear from eBay France. A simple job of removing the timing gear cover and unbolting it and replacing it. Now the car was running pretty reliably, I was able to look at some of the other things. It had some rather inappropriate rear lights at the back, so I was able to find this nice period French rear light from a French stall at the Bewley Auto Jumble. I also made up the missing lamp bracket that was on the driver's side of the car, and these would have been used for riding lights in the 1920s, like the one I've got here. When the car was delivered, it had a black plastic bag in one of the windows, and this is because the Hotch has a very complicated series of pulleys for the window winders, and including some sort of rubber type material for the pulleys, as you can see here, which were going all hard and breaking up. So I made new wooden pulleys out of birch, which is a nice light fine-grained wood, and replaced the rubber pulleys with these, and now the windows work properly. When I bought the car, it had a modern oil pressure gauge on the dashboard, which looked horrible, but in a box were two Maliver oleometer gauges, flow gauges. These cars only work at a few pounds pressure, and this is what was on the dashboard originally. So I combined the two and changed the membrane and fitted it to the dashboard, and it now has that nice proper vintage look. As the oil pressure rises, the red gives way to white, and so you know you've got a bit of oil flowing through the engine. Not very much, but a bit. Generally the Hotchkiss has been pretty reliable, but one thing that did fail me was the rear axle. You tend to think that they're bomb-proof, but they're not. So after another trip to Dinnington Docks to see my friends in Somerset, I just got home, and the bearings in the pinion, which is this bit that sticks out the axle, had seized up. Now pinion bearings are very prone to getting rain and condensation in them because they have quite a poor sealing in the original axle. So a vehicle that's been neglected and just left alone can get water in it. This is a cross section of a Hotchkiss rear axle, and you can see the whole series of bearings going down the pinion, and these are the ones that had all failed, and they'd seized up just before I got home. And you can see this is one of the thrust bearings that's all rusty, and some of the ball bearings had actually been forced out of their race, but it only happened just a few meters from home. So the repair is a question of sourcing bearings, some of which I could get, others I had to make up with oilite spacers, and carefully pressing them back onto the pinion. I once had another failure with the rear axle as well, where this locking collar, the original locking collar, the threads had weakened and it just skipped a thread. So I had a new one made by a local engineering firm, as you can see here, and that locked it all up nice and tight again. I also at the same time had the bushers for the spider replaced because they were pretty worn. This is actually in the differential that alters the speed from one side of the axle to the other. And the next photograph, you can see the spider actually sitting in the central part of the differential. It's a bit tricky getting the differential in and out of the rear axle. You can't take it out of the backplate aperture as I show here. You have to take the pinion housing on and off. But once you've restored all the bearings and you put them back together, you can either put them together on the bench or you can put the crown wheel and pinion together in the axle like this, and then you have to adjust the meshing of the crown wheel and the pinion gears. This diagram from a 1930s engineering book shows the black wear areas, whether your adjustment is correct or incorrect. And to correct the adjustment, you mainly have to adjust the pinion shaft in and out to get that correct setting. And you can show that by covering the teeth with grease or engineer's blue or spray paint and rotating them, and then you'll see where the teeth mesh together. So that will be shown where the grease or paint has been rubbed off by the teeth as they mesh together. So you'll get bare areas, and then you have to just keep the adjustment until you get it right. You can do it by feel really without having to do all this, but you do run the risk of noise or damage to the rear axle. But it's all about reducing the backlash to a safe amount really. I have to say I'm no expert in any of this, and I just learn on the hoof, and I take things apart and I work out how they work, and I read books, and generally it works okay. Sometimes I make mistakes, but you know, that's how you learn. Well, another job was to sort out the tangle of modern wiring that had been put in behind the dashboard and a modern fuse box, and change the instruments. I managed to get a French Jaeger clock, and a friend in Australia sent me a similar speedometer. I had to alter the drive at the back of it, and then I renovated the original Ducellier switchboard that was just used as a dummy to cover a modern switchboard, fuse board rather. And so now it all looks pretty handsome, I think. And then there come, of course, a series of improvements as you go along, putting softer front brake shoes on, wheel bearings, getting the rear springs retempered, having the head skimmed with a new head gasket, and changing the ever leaking original fuel tap for a modern one that I had to put M21 threads on either end. Of course, there are always things going on with an oily rag car, but they can be made very reliable, and the Hotchkiss is pretty reliable, and we've had lots of trips out in it. But anyone who buys an oily rag car, or indeed any vintage car, must expect there to be running repairs. But